Hello and welcome. Hello, welcome, especially to those that are watching us today. My name is Chris, and I'm here today with Annie Lee. Annie is a recruiter, and as I've learned, you actually work for startups, and scale-ups in the local scene in Berlin. And the difference between what we typically in the data field understand as recruiting, i.e. that there's a recruiting agency or a recruiter that you work with that then presents you at a company, is that you work for a firm, but you actually work inside the companies. So I want to ask you, how did you get into that line of helping people with recruiting?
Thank you so much, Chris, and thank you so much, Tanya, for having me as well. I actually just stumbled upon recruitment as a job. 2 years ago, I was looking for a job myself, and I thought I wanted to be in startups. Doesn't matter where, but I wanted to kind of just be in the middle of where everything is happening and really be hands-on and build something. I came across Accelerate, then ended up working with Accelerate for 2 years or so up until now. How we work is typically we go into different startups and scale-ups, as you mentioned correctly, to help them build up a talent acquisition function or to help them scale their talent acquisition function. So in my personal experience, I've worked with companies like BCG Digital Ventures, and then a few earlier stage startups, mostly B2B SaaS companies like Back, like Talent Space, and currently I'm working with Blinkist together to help them hire. So that's my story.
Thank you, Annie. I actually imagine this as relatively challenging. Also, given the examples and the companies that you mentioned, and that we said initially you work for scale-ups. So these are companies that presumably have paying customers and probably have venture capital and are now under pressure actually to grow. They really need to scale. So I imagine that this is quite challenging and demanding for you. So what do you like about it?
Good question. People person. I love speaking to people. And I think talent acquisition is both a job that is very strategic because you need to be very connected to the entire organization. You need to be very sensitive and up to date to the business and growing needs of the organization. And then that translates to how you can potentially design openings, design jobs, and then start to interview and speak to people. At the same time, it's very detailed because we're speaking to one person at a time. You need to be very empathetic to your candidate's needs, to their professional growth, and then potentially find a match. So it's very interesting. I think it uses different professional muscles, let's say. And then at the end of the day, I get to meet wonderful people every day, and that's what keeps me going.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. You mentioned while you were speaking, so to speak, that you come into a company, and if I understood correctly, the first thing that you need to do is you need to understand the requirements of the organization that you're working with. Can you say a bit more about how does that work?
Yeah, 100%. So if we think about an organization, and in my case, most of the times I work with earlier stage startups that are maybe 10, 20 people. And then sometimes I work with slightly bigger organization that might have raised one or two rounds of funding and they're ready to kind of keep growing, and maybe they're between 50 to 100 people or sometimes even more. First thing we need to do typically is then to understand where they are at as a company and as a business. We need to understand the product or the service very, very thoroughly. Then we need to understand what the current organization looks like in order to run this product or service successfully, and then what their challenges are. So then that translates into, so firstly, we have this business need, and then that translates into, should we open up a job for this? What does this person would have to do? What would that exactly look like? And then that translates into the next step, which is the job description. We say, okay, they need to do this, so therefore, maybe we want to look for someone that has this type of skills or this type of experience. So this is how it translates from the very higher kind of strategy level to the very kind of down to earth, like job description level responsibilities.
Okay, so let's assume you've got there. So then you have the job description. Now, you're a recruiter that works with a company temporarily. So how do you go finding the people?
For the bigger organizations that have maybe 50, 100 people or even more, that have been in the market for a while, they've had their own employer branding that's relatively more established. So, for example, currently I'm working with Blinkist, and I think a lot of people in Berlin have heard about Blinkist or used Blinkist product. In that case, we do receive a lot of inbound applications because B2B consumer products, if you are a user yourself, then it makes a lot more sense what the company might be doing. And then it makes sense for you to apply. So for Blinkist, we get a lot of inbound applications, but at the same time, we work with referrals, and then sometimes we reach out to candidates directly to invite them to the interview process. For some of the smaller organizations, when they're at 10, 20 people, it's a little bit harder. In that case, we have to be a bit more creative with what we can do within our budgets and resources. We don't get as many inbound applications in that case, but for example, maybe we reach out to communities a bit more. We are active in Slack groups, and sometimes maybe we'll have our leadership team themselves maybe do events to try to make sure that people understand our employer brand. But overall, in general, there are primarily kind of 3, maybe 4 different ways that we get candidates.
Okay.
We get candidates through applications. So people applying directly through job sites, job boards, pretty straightforward. Or we get candidates through sourcing, and sourcing means us reaching out on LinkedIn to people directly or maybe another social media platform. Thirdly, we get people through referral programs. Most companies will have an internal referral program because they know that if they have a good team and this team might have a really good network and we can get someone there much quicker, and it could be much more of a, let's say, verified talent. And then on top of that, I think usually we categorize different sorts of like networking into, like we try to channel that into the referral program, but sometimes, let's say serendipitously, some kind of networking opportunity could happen.
Sure.
But in general, these are the 3 different ways that we can receive candidates.
Okay. I'm now very tempted to ask you follow-up questions about the quantity and the quality of these channels.
Yes.
So whether you can, and actually with the eye to people that are watching us today or listening or will watch this later, right? So on the other side today are mainly people who are perhaps looking for a first or second role or their next challenge. So how do these channels work? How can I make them work?
Yeah, great question. So I would suggest our viewers or whoever is watching this right now, I think first thing is you need to understand a bit more about your target companies, because if they're more established and if they're more known, they're definitely going to get a lot of inbound applications. So that's definitely the first thing. And second thing is that we're still in a market that has not fully recovered from the effects of the pandemic. So that means there are not going to be as many jobs as people applying to them, especially maybe for some of the junior positions in tech, unfortunately. So that means you're going to be facing a lot more of an intense competition versus, let's say, 2 years ago, right? Summer 2019 or so. I think typically, maybe to give an example to illustrate how intense the competition can be. For junior positions, expect somewhere between 50 to 500 people that are competing with you at any given point. It's a pretty big range, but if you have 50 other people competing with you for the same position, then those chances are already a little bit more slimmer. In one case, for example, I open up a role that's a junior position sitting in our data team. We put the job ad on LinkedIn Jobs, and then after 2 days, we received 200 applications. And after a week, we received 550 applications, which is very, very crazy because it's only just me working on the other side trying to process all of these applications. And the thing is, a lot of these people could be competent and they could be good at this job, but it's just a matter of fact that is at the end of the day, we're only offering one position. So this is a very a very realistic situation that we're facing right now. What I would recommend, though, is then if you were to start your search, really narrow down and have a focus. A lot of the people that I coach in my free time would tell me, I don't want to miss out on any chances. What if this company could work for me? So therefore, I want to I want to spread the nets a bit wider, right? But then at the end of the day, I think you're only hurting your chances if you're not making your profile differentiated, if you're not making kind of dedicated efforts towards these different companies and their very different needs, then at the end of the day, your chances are going to be the same. It's not going to increase your chance anymore. So find your focus from the beginning, narrow down that list, and make sure that you're really speaking to those companies and the business needs that the position is designed for.
I have in my mind several questions now. So
Yes.
I'm going to try and structure. Actually, first I wanted to follow up. So I personally, from my own experience, and I've been working with people also on their CVs, agree that you need to focus. The way I like to do this is that I get people to write a mission statement on to take the profile statement as a mission statement, to say who they are, what they bring to the table, what they're really looking for, and to get them to be really specific and to say, I want to work in the health sector, and it's got to be a startup, and it has to be in Berlin or Munich, and I want to start next autumn. Yeah, so to get really, really specific and somehow motivate why they want to do that. But in your experience, what can people do to help themselves develop this focus?
100% agree with you. And I think the harder question for a lot of early career professionals that I speak to would be, they don't know what's specific enough in that case. So it becomes really challenging because they can simply write something that they think is specific enough, and then it gets to, let's say, the recruiting team or the company that's receiving the application, and then it doesn't really stand out at the end of the day. I cannot see Chris's video anymore, but if you're listening to this, I would say think of your job search process. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be a long-term strategy where you have to be very honest, very introspective with yourself. I always talk to my job seeker community that there are 3 elements that I think are always crucial. There's your profile, there's the companies that you're targeting, and there's your approach. If you have all these 3 things figured out, then your life is going to be so much easier. Chris, you mentioned a bit about the profile, building up your mission statements and thinking about your motivation, and be specific about your skills. So typically I break down your profile into roughly 3 or 4 sections. Profile does not necessarily mean CV or cover letter or any concrete material that you write down, but you have to know this information. So it includes your skills, which are split between, let's say, technical skills. In this case, it could be the data knowledge, data science knowledge that you have, or technologies that you work with, and at the same time, organizational and interpersonal skills. This is typically called hard skills and soft skills, but if we use hard skills and soft skills, these terms, people think that the soft skills are less important, which is completely not the case. But understand that you have to think about your concrete technical skills, what you actually offer there, and what you can offer in terms of your organizational and interpersonal skills.
Okay.
Then, motivation, mission, like you said, is another section. And then lastly, I'd also encourage people to think about their experiences in terms of achievements and impact, rather than just like, what I did exactly for the organizations.
Understood. Thank you. But just before I move on, apologies to the audience. In the meantime, somehow my internet collapsed. I have no idea why, because the speed is principally there. But back. So you said something interesting just now about technical skills versus business or organizational skills, and I want to link those two to make a step back. So something that I also see when looking at CVs and looking how to promote people is that I have a way of saying, the technical skills in the data career, if they're good enough, they help you to avoid the no. They help you to avoid the no. But to get to the yes, it actually matters what your business and organization skills are. And it's not sufficient to claim them. You have to demonstrate, show, and prove them with specific examples. Now, I see you nodding, so I'm going to loop this to a question. You said, I have a pile of 550. what can a candidate expect? How is a company going to sort through that pile?
So, in a lot of cases, we typically want to potentially maybe invite the applicants to go through maybe a simple assessment stage. So to understand that, maybe they meet some of the basic requirements of what we're looking for in order for someone to do a good job in this role. And 100% agree with you. The technical skills then would be able to get you through probably the first or second stage. The further along the process, the more we need to look at whether you're a good teammate to potentially work with and whether you're someone that can contribute maybe a bit more long-term to the company and that you're someone that can grow. So I would always recommend job seekers to also really map out the entire interview process, maybe somewhere in their own job search tracker in their document, or potentially maybe just write it down, right? So I think for most of the, let's say like 95% of the job search processes here in Berlin, you're going to encounter like 3 or 4 different stages, most likely 4. So the first stage is the application review, where you send in your CV, cover letter, and then you wait for a response. Then the second stage would be a first interview, which is usually a first conversation with a recruiter, someone like me, someone from the HR team, or maybe another team member. So the first conversation here is always to just get to know you as a person beyond your cover letter and CV, to make sure that you're able to communicate fluently and your expectations match what we can offer, and your general experiences match what you say on your CV. Then the third stage is typically then a more in-depth conversation with maybe the hiring manager. So the hiring manager is usually the head of the department that's hiring. So this person could be like head of, in some cases like director of, VP, CEO, or engineering manager. And here you're going to expect a very technical conversation that might be a bit more in depth. So they will ask you your field knowledge and to just understand your expertise. And then, last but not least, you'll potentially meet the rest of the team, have conversations with them, and depending on the case, you might also go through a technical assessment. But these are the stages that you should expect. So mapping out that process helps you realize that, in order to go through each process, it might take you 3 to 4 weeks. So then think about how many processes do you potentially have to go through in order to maybe land a successful offer, and then really long-term plan out your timeline like that and say, it's not going to be 1 month in most cases. It's probably going to take you more than a month to go through a few different processes and to make sure you land at least one offer. Ideal cases, you land a few so that you can choose from. I've spoken to especially a lot of folks who have just finished a boot camp or a course, really, ready to apply to jobs. And unfortunately, most of the times it takes at least 3 to 4 months for them to land that ideal job. And having these things mapped out somewhere really, really helps you emotionally prepare for that process, and also plan your day-to-day and plan for the upcoming weeks.
Understood. So Shreyasta has posted a comment about narrowing down the specifics of what you're looking for in your experience. Of course, with prior experience, that gets easier. I want to use this to build a bridge. So you work as a consultant and you go in startups and scales ups and help them to recruit. But I also know that you work as a coach. So this is something we kind of share, because I have been also doing this for years now. It started when I was the director of a bootcamp, and me realizing that data science, half the stuff is the technical skills, but actually the other half is the employability, the job search, and that it really, really matters to bootcamp graduates whether your search time is like 1 month after the bootcamp, so you need to start during the bootcamp, or you kind of lose it and it doesn't work, and you spend 6 or 9 or even 12 months unemployed after the bootcamp, which actually is horrendous and not a horrific experience, and how to avoid that. And this is how I got really interested in how do you do a CV, how do you structure it, working with recruiters, what do you need to do for a company to say, yes, I want to interview the person, right? The CV gets you the interview, it doesn't get you hired, but that it does. So now I understand you do the same, and you actually also do the same for for early stage people, so in the early years of the career. Can you tell us a little bit about how this goes about, where people can find you, and what you do?
Yeah, so it happened last year because a friend of mine just came to me for general job search advice. And then I
Mm-hmm.
realized there's such a big information gap between the needs of the hiring team and what job seekers are actually preparing for. So I started to coach people on a one-on-one level since August last year.
Mm-hmm.
Now I've kind of tried to open this up a little bit by launching a newsletter called
Mm-hmm.
anycoaching.substack.com. So here I talk about anything ranging from preparing for your application, planning for your search, interviewing, all the way to the end to maybe like, what red flags to look for when you're interviewing with companies. So that's one thing that I do on the side, but typically what I would advise early career professionals and job seekers in tech is try to linking to, for example, the question that we got asked here is to firstly really be introspective. And once you understand what you're looking for, then start to plan out the type of companies that you want to apply for. Notice that here we focus more on companies rather than positions specifically, because you cannot understand why a position require these things unless you understand the context of the company. So
Okay.
what I typically suggest is, let's say, divide all of your ideal companies into three tiers. Tier one, tier two, tier three. Tier one companies are companies that are most ideal. Let's say they fit 90% of you're looking for in terms of culture, mission, products. And then let's say here you want to have a good handful of, let's say, 5 to 7 companies that are in tier one. And then tier two are companies that maybe meet 80% of your needs. Most of the important things are there, but some things are missing, but you're fine with it. You still want to give it a shot. Here, maybe you want to keep 10 to 15 companies. And then in the end, tier three, widen up the scope, 70% fits. Then you keep, let's say, 15 to 20 companies here. Think of this as like a pyramid shape. On top, the most ideal bit, you have the smallest amount of companies so that you can really focus and say, the next 2 weeks, I'm going to do whatever I can to know everything about these 5 companies. I want to speak to all the people that are working there. I want to maybe try and get a few referrals. I want to see how I can cater my application. This is why I recommend focusing on a small handful of companies, because it's going to be a
Mm-hmm.
very time-consuming process to do that. And then after 2 weeks, let's say, you say, I don't have enough action going on here. Maybe I need to move on. Now you move on
Mm-hmm.
to tier two companies, which are maybe
Mm-hmm.
like, 10 companies, and you do the same for like 3, 4 weeks. And then you slowly move on to your tier three. That could be one of the ways that you optimize your search.
Very interesting, because the candidate is always aware of the fact that the companies shortlist the candidates, right? And you're suggesting actually applying pretty much the same strategy as a candidate, the other way around,
Yeah.
to kind of, yeah, to kind of say, okay, so this is my top tier one, this is what I'm most interested in, and so on, and
Yeah.
have a like plan B and plan C, if you so like. That's really interesting. What else can candidates do to help themselves?
I think a lot of times people forget to ask for help, and you can do this in a variety of different ways. There are a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people in the community, and there are people like me. Like, I'm not the only recruiter who's giving job search advice. There are a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people out there that are willing to help. But unless you make that step, and unless you discover which communities you can be active in, it's going to be hard for us to give you help. So connect with people. I'd recommend really finding your community and potentially really be active in those communities. Secondly, don't worry about and don't hesitate with maybe reaching out to people on LinkedIn or another social media platform directly. If you really like their content, if you really admire them, if you really respect them as an expert in the field, then I'm sure you have a good conversation starter, right? And then that could easily lead to, you asking for them to take a look at your CV, your application
Mm-hmm.
materials, for them to
Mm-hmm.
give some tips. And in some cases, don't even hesitate to ask for a referral. And you can always put it nicely but clearly that you're looking for a job and you would receive you would really appreciate their help. But at the same time, say, if you need if you need to just check your application and background, if you need any more information, happy to jump on a call with you for 15 minutes, for example. And then for me, that's a very clear and direct and friendly message. Don't hesitate to do things like that. I think when people think about networking, it's very daunting. It's like, oh, we're not in face-to-face events anymore. So how do I sneakily walk up to a group and jump into that conversation? There are a lot of different things that you can do. And don't be afraid to be a bit more creative. For example, I was working with a designer who's been in startups and tech companies for 15 years, and he formerly worked at Google as well. And I asked him, what would you do if you were to look for a job right now? And he said he would actually create a project that is, in a way, really shocking and exciting and really, really out of the box. And then he would draw attention to the project. And then he would speak to people about job opportunities through that project, which I thought was really interesting because a lot of early career professionals are not people who are just looking for jobs. A lot of you guys have been in the field for well, not the same field, but you've been working for so many years, and you probably have something that you can bring to the table that doesn't have to be, startup or tech experience per se, but there's so many things that you can do and think outside of the box for. So these are a few examples.
I follow, yeah. So, I mean, by doing something unusual or out of the box, you kind of draw attention, and it's one of these ways in which you can stand out. I wanted to go back for a minute to this networking and daunting and so on, and how do I meet people and get referrals and so on. So, I mean, this is exactly the thing, right? So, on the one hand, the usual channel is that you apply, and sometimes you even have to write a cover letter, and well, then that's what you do. Yep. But there are these other possibilities, right? Kind of like this idea of networking yourself to a job and doing a project and using it is in the realm. Okay, so I want your opinion on this. So something that I really like to ask people to do is, I say, okay, so you're writing a CV, and actually in Europe, you're still writing a CV. It's not so much a resume, and it's probably got 2 pages. And at the top of your CV, I want this profile statement that is a mission statement. And I always work with them and say, it needs to be 4 lines, 3 sentences, 4 lines, something like that are standalone. And the point here is precisely this, that I think that if you want to network, use networks, you need a CV that speaks entirely for itself, is standalone, doesn't really require any other words around, because your real opportunity is there's somebody that who perhaps you even talk to, but that it's not the person that has the job, it's a connection that has the job, and you have no direct connection. And then you actually need that thing to be so self-complete that it works for the other person without ever actually having talked to anybody in the first instance.
Yeah.
So, okay, I see you nodding and agreeing. So, I mean, how do I maximize my chances to get a job through networks and referrals?
I think the idea of mission statement is even important if you're applying directly and if you're not going through a network. I think you just want to make sure that the document not only shows what you've done, but also who you are. And that's what I struggle to really grasp from most CVs that I read, unfortunately. They just tell me, I'm motivated to look for a next step in the industry. And I'm like, that's the most generic, most vague motivation I could ever think of. And people underestimate how frequently used this type of sentence would be. So 100% agree with you there. And I think that's why at the beginning of the search, there needs to be a very introspective and honest conversation with yourself.
Okay. This is how it connects. I see. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Maybe just one more to respond to your question on networking. I recommend to follow 2 principles: to be clear, direct, and also to be friendly. Sometimes people miss one or the other. A lot of times it's mostly because people are very vague when they're networking. I get a lot of messages that are like, "Hi, I see you're in recruitment, would love to connect." And I'm like, okay, what are you connecting with me for? What's the goal? What's the purpose? Or sometimes people ask for a lot, but don't really give anything in return. And I find that to be a very one-way conversation. People will say, oh, I'm looking for a job in data. Can you help me? And I'm like, how do you want me to help me exactly? Like, I'm not a headhunter. I don't work like that. And I think it's just very abrupt. So make sure you're having a nice, really like human conversation. If it's not something that you'd be comfortable walking up to a real human in front of you and saying, then don't say that in a reach out or a networking message anywhere, whether it's email or LinkedIn. At the end of the day, you're affecting a real human and how they work. So yeah, that would be my suggestion.
Thank you, Annie. So what you're saying here is make the connection. I realize that our 30 minutes are over. So thank you to all of those that have watched us. Thank you for the question, Shreyasta. Thank you very much again to Annie for spending the 30 minutes with us. I hope it's been useful, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Have a good day, everyone.